Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy, back from a dance-off with some moose. And today we're talking about this, the Sigma 30mm f1.4 DC-DN lens for APS-C mirrorless cameras. This lens was recently released for Canon RF mount, finally, and I believe Nikon Z mount, think Fuji X mount, and Sony E mount, of course, but this one actually is Canon's EFM mount version because I have a modified EFM camera and I wanted to test this lens out. So this is a Sigma lens. It is thus well appointed. It's part of their contemporary line. So it's not the art series, but it's still well made. And there are a couple of things to note. Of course, we have a hood here. It's got a knurled ring around it. And the front element's rather minuscule with a 52mm filter thread. It is not unexpected that it's that big. It's nice and compact. There are, depending on, I guess, what mount you're using, various competitors to this. Canon has a 32mm f1.4 lens. I'm sure Fuji has dozens of competitors to this. And there's probably something in Sony E mount as well. Whatever the case, these are going to perform very similarly. The one thing I do want to note, though, specific to this review is that since I am testing this on a EFM mount camera, this lens is going to be slightly cropped in versus what you would get with any of the other brands. So please keep that in mind. The corners and edges are not going to show you the full story that you would see on a non-Canon APS-C camera like Sony E mount. Overall, though, it's a nice lens, good in the hand. Does feel like a metal body. We pop off the edge. No gasket on this one. I'm not sure if that's the same or different for other brands, but it's been out for a while, released in 2016, so coming up on 9 years here. And yeah, let's stop talking about it. There's nothing else to see on the outside besides a moderately loose, electronically coupled focus ring. So let's just look at the samples and see what this lens has to show us.
Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom, where we're going to take a look at the Sigma 30mm f1.4 DC-DN contemporary lens, released in 2016 for all of these mounts. And specifically, the copy I have today is for Canon EFM mount. Canon EFM mount, of course, Canon's M mount system is now discontinued and has been superseded by the RF mount system, but the sensor size is still the same, and this lens has been released for both systems, so they'll be directly comparable. One thing I do want to note, Canon here uses a different sized sensor than pretty much the other manufacturers, of course, micro four thirds notwithstanding, but for Nikon, Sony, Fuji, all of their APS systems actually use a slightly bigger sensor than Canon does. And what that means is, in these samples that we're going to look at, we're not going to maybe get the exact corners and edges. You'll get a little more field of view on a Fuji camera, for instance, but here it should still provide you the bulk of what you really want to see about this lens. Today I'm using a Canon EOS M6, which I pinched for my daughter. Don't worry, I've returned it. I had to fall back to this camera because this lens has a weird quirk. So I have a M6 Mark II 33 megapixel camera. It's great. Same sensor that is in the Canon R7 and also the 90D, previous generation DSLR. Great sensor. Only thing is my M6 Mark II is modified, and to maintain a normal color reproduction, I have a clip-in filter that goes in there and kind of restores it back to quote unquote factory, except it's not quite factory. Sometimes there can be a little bit of a tilt, which I think can throw things off a little bit. But one thing I did notice when testing these Sigma primes for APS-C is that the motors they use in them, I assume they're stepper motors, quite literally focus in little steps. And when you're trying to focus to infinity, you get little stops. You get little literal step stops when you're focusing. You don't get a smooth, continuous focus. So with my M6 Mark II, probably because of the filter and the fact that there's maybe a slightly different refractive index or something going on, I couldn't get it in focus exactly properly. It would be a little out of focus or a little too much past infinity, and nothing I could do could fix that. So I fell back on the M6 here. 24 megapixels, it's still plenty. We'll still get tons of detail, and as we'll see, so don't worry too much about that. This lens is nominally on a typical, like a Fuji or a Nikon APS-C camera, you'll get a 45mm-ish equivalent field of view, and on a Canon, you'll get around a 48mm-ish field of view, so keep that in mind. And because of that, I didn't bother with untracked samples. These are all tracked with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. Fervent Astronomy is, of course, Fornax's North American distributor, so if you're interested in learning more about that mount, head on over to ferventastronomy.com and you can learn more there. And of course, since these are tracked, that allows me to do 60-second exposures, so we get a lot of light, and to make sure that we have a real nice star trail free view. And here we're using ISO 320 because as an ISO invariant camera, the EOS M6 has, let's say it's almost like third base ISO here. Here's the base ISO. It's the second native ISO. And here we can see there's a little bit of zigzagging to the graph here, so it's possible that there's some more analog amplification steps every couple of stops here. But 320 is where you get mostly linear response, so that's why I chose 320, and it's perfectly fine for what we were doing. If you're curious about what I was just talking about and what that graph was and what's going on, well, somewhere around the top of the screen right now is a link to a video on ISO invariance that will explain everything. Otherwise, if you go to the description, there's a link back to my website, and there's a link there that will take you to a really nice article that'll talk to you all about ISO invariance and explain why I'm doing that. Just know this is the optimal ISO for this particular camera within reason. If you follow that same link in the description, you will get a link to these samples in full RAW where you can download them, pixel peep, process them, look in the corners, look in the edges, see everything that you might need to see. I just ask, please respect my copyright. I had to buy this lens. I had to steal my kid's camera. Don't worry, it's been returned. And then I had to go and do this. This is like the second or third time I've actually taken samples for this review. So I put skin in the game. Please respect that. Thanks so much. And without further ado, let's just get into it here. So you notice I have two samples at f1.4. One seems to be focused at 4.73 meters from the camera, and one is at infinity. And why am I including both? Well, I use a Batinov mask for focusing, and these samples here, the whole major run is all at that quote unquote 4.73 meter distance. But the Batinov mask was telling me this was the most focused of the available choices, those little jumps that it was making. I did include this one shot at infinity just so you can kind of compare. And if we come in here into the center of this frame and then swap back and forth with the other, we can kind of see that the focus is more or less the same, although this one here, the Batinov mask was saying this is a little bit better focus. So that's why we're doing that. But I'll include the other sample there just in case you want to take a look at it. All right, so here we have the first sample of our run, 1.4. And if we look in the navigator, we can see that there is some vignetting in the corners there. It's not the worst vignetting I've seen, but it is there. There is a general sense that there's not a lot of contrast here in the center of the frame. So if we stop down to 1.6, we do see that the exposure kind of drops a little bit in the middle there. And we're getting a little bit better contrast here. However, if you watch the histogram, when I go from 1.4 to 1.6, the left side of the histogram shifts to the left. What that is telling me is we're also losing some exposure in the corners, which isn't actually that great. If you think that this is a little too washed out and you want this a little more even, there you go. Although if we do stop down to 1.8, you'll notice that the histogram on the left-hand side does not shift. So 1.6, 1.8, that means that the edges are not getting darker, or the darker parts of the frame are not getting darker, only the lighter parts of the frame. And that is creating a more even exposure and more contrast. So perhaps you want to stay at f1.8, who knows? But since we're here, let's just stop down a little bit more. f2, f2.2, f2.5, and f2.8. And we're getting pretty dark. We don't have a lot of exposure coming in here, even at a 60-second exposure. So whether or not you think that's worth it, I'll leave that up to you. If we zoom in here on the center, well, a couple of things going on. First of all, we've got some color fringing, some purple and pinkish color fringing. This is telling me that this lens cannot focus the red and blue wavelengths of light at the same focus distance. So the reason it's fringing and bloating like this is literally because these wavelengths are out of focus. That said, I don't see a lot of bloating on the other stars, so I don't think we have any spherical aberration to worry about, just that chromatic aberration. One thing that I noticed right away though, notice how everything kind of looks like it's going this way. You know, if you look at these stars, they almost got like a little blur on this side, and they seem to be elongated. This is not a tracking error. This is actually an optical error in the lens. So what's happening in here is that there might be a tilt in an element, or maybe decentering, although that's a little bit less common. And what you can have is these stars getting stretched out. What's actually happening is that they're actually more well focused on the right-hand side than they are on the left-hand side. And if you were to defocus, you'd see that it would sort of defocus preferentially on one side there. So this isn't great. It is similar to coma, or I guess it might technically be coma, although it's not showing up in the usual way. What is coma? Coma, or chromatic aberration, is when one side of a specular highlight like this, a pinpoint, will fuzz out, other side stays sharp, so you're basically kind of losing focus on one side. And typically it'll all either have the little tails pointing towards the center of the frame for internal coma, or the edges for external coma. And here, that's not actually what's happening. Everything's kind of pointed slightly to the left and down. So this, I don't think, is meant to be part of the optical formula. I think this is maybe a quality control issue. It's hard to say, but it exists. It made it out into the wild. It's something that you should expect as being in the realm of possibility if you buy this lens. And why coma? Why chromatic aberration? Well, coma is named after comets because comets get a little fuzz called coma, and that is where that name comes from if you're curious. If we stop down here in the center, this is 1.6, 1.8. You can see, especially on this star here, it's pretty apparent. Stopping down to 1.6 does clean that edge up there, which is pretty decent. And then 1.8, not a huge difference, but these stars, maybe they show a little bit more, a little bit more cleaning up there. So 1.8 might be the best spot for this lens, actually. That said, you can see the stars look long in this direction, right? They're all kind of horizontally pulled out. That's just going to be what it is. Can't really help that. F2, 2.2, we're not really cleaning up the chromatic aberration much. 2.5, 2.8. Yeah, it's pretty dark. Chromatic aberration is being restricted, but so is all light there. So, your mileage may vary. Let's look in the top left-hand corner. So here we're at f2.8, and we can see some funny business. We'll just scroll back to 1.4 here. And okay, so we see some weird shapes, right? These are stars. These are supposed to be round. Here they're long. This one almost looks like a little arrow or an airplane or something, or little birds. And what we're seeing here is called astigmatism. This is not coma. A lot of people misname this, and it just kind of self-propagates on the internet. But this is astigmatism. So what's happening is that, if you don't have astigmatism in your eyes, you're not sure how it works. As we get away from the optical axis here towards the edges, the lens is having trouble keeping these pinpoints in a pinpoint. And what that results in is these stars being stretched out along the radii that go from the center to the edges, and they get long and stretched out, and that's called tangential astigmatism. For these stars where it looks like they have little wings, this is sagittal astigmatism. So it occurs at a right angle to these radii. So these radii are like this, and everywhere that there's a star along one of those radii, you'll get an intersection there at a right angle, and that will cause sagittal astigmatism to look like it rings the frame. Tangential points sort of toward or away from the center. Sagittal is at a 90 degree from that. And yeah, it's the same thing, just happening in two different axes, but they are independent. And as you stop down, some might clear up more than others. So here, 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, a little bit of tucking into the wings here. F2, a little bit more, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. So the sagittal is mostly taken care of. Problem is, nothing has happened to that tangential astigmatism. These stars are still stretched out, and that is not great. It's just not great. These will look weird when zoomed out sometimes. If they're small enough and you have a image that's low resolution enough, it'll kind of hide it. So this is why a lower megapixel camera for this lens might actually be a good choice. This 24 megapixels or even a 20 megapixel camera. The Nikons are still 20 megapixels for the most part. So, there you go. The color there, this is that chromatic aberration. A little bit of that blue is the blue fringing we saw, but you'll also notice that there's a little bit of almost like teal or blue, and that is more classic chromatic aberration. One other thing that we can note while we are here, these stars are slightly out of focus. We're experiencing field curvature. So I'll snap to the center, and you see how tiny these stars are, these sort of not as bright stars, even though they are stretched out due to their own little problems. You can see how things are just bigger here. Here's another example, small, bigger. Weird shapes, but also bigger. So this is field curvature. What's happening here? Well, it's curved glass trying to focus light rays onto a flat surface, and that's hard. So you might get really crisp focus in the middle, but it's hard to maintain that focus all the way to the edges and corners like this. And essentially, they're going out of focus. In these cases, you can actually focus for the corners, and this field curvature will put the corner stars in focus and put the center stars out of focus. That said, it will not help the astigmatism. It'll actually make the astigmatism worse. It'll bring it more into focus and make it a little bit more noticeable. So this might actually be a good compromise, to be honest. And we can look at another corner here, see the shapes are mostly the same. This corner, a little bit different shaped here. So, there's a little loss of symmetry. And then this corner, again, slightly different shapes. So there's like a little unevenness. This isn't a $2,000 lens, so we can be a little bit lenient and not be too hard on it. But yeah, the problem is if the corners and edges, at least for me, if they start to become noticeable, if the stars here look really big relative to the center, that kind of gives it a weird view, and it's not too bad. Let's pop into the develop module here, choose some of these. We'll remove chromatic aberration. And you see how it kind of is doing a little bit of something on them? Well, that's because there is, especially on the edges here, more noticeable chromatic aberration. So it's able to even some of that out, although it's not actually dealing with the fringing because that's sort of a different manifestation. So we can use our little defringe dropper and do a decent job of color correcting that. And I don't see any checkerboarding, which is an artifact that can happen when you do this. So for the most part, I think that's okay. Ooh, that one's pretty bad. Yeah, I think that's doable. That'll help make those stars a little bit less distracting. And if we put our profile corrections on, oh, that's actually not bad. So this shares something in common with the 16mm 1.4 from Sigma, in that this is probably some of the best vignetting correction that I've seen from a built-in profile. So that's really great. It's evening that exposure out. And if we flip this off and on a couple of times, you can see that there is some distortion being corrected. We have some barrel distortion. So the center kind of bulges out towards the viewer and the corners wrap away. And when we flip this on, center gets compressed and the corners will get stretched out. And if we scale down, we can see what's happening. See, it's literally stretching the corners and cropping them out. And if we flip it off and on a couple of times, you get that general idea there. One thing that is interesting about this is we are not losing any angle of view. Vertically, there's no change. You'll see these stars won't disappear off the frame. But if you watch these stars on the other edge here, horizontally, we are losing some angle of view. And of course, in the corners, we're losing some diagonal angle of view. But this isn't turning into a portrait lens by any means. It is still maintaining whatever you framed in the center. So I don't see any reason not to do this. And just looking at the frame with the corrections on, it's not great. You can see things start to kind of look a little bit blurry, especially in some of the corners where there's more stars to notice. That's that field curvature, but it's not horrible. Lower megapixel camera, I think this is probably a good match for. So, but with that, let's get out of here and wrap up this review.
All right, well, at least on a higher megapixel camera, something like one of Fuji's 40 megapixel cameras, maybe not a good match for this. Nikon, Z50 or Z52 with a 20 megapixel sensor, probably better. It's probably going to hide some more of those optical faults, but overall, depending on what brand you're in, you will have another option or won't. And if you don't, well, this lens is pretty compelling. If you do and that option is better, it's up to you to decide. But hopefully I've given you the tools to do so. And if you have found those tools useful, now I always hate asking this, but if you wouldn't mind giving the video a thumbs up if you did find it useful or enjoyable, that really helps get the video seen, and leaving a comment especially. And I'm a chatty person. I love chatting with people. So please just leave a comment anyway if you just love to chat. I'm here to talk about lenses. I'm here to talk about astronomy. Just love it all. And basically, that is my plea to you, to your viewer. So I'm Darren, Fervent Astronomy. Thanks so much. Hopefully we will see you in the next one.